Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a massive century-spanning story that quite literally reshaped the modern world as we know it. We are looking at the evolution of one of the most recognizable brands on the entire planet, Shell. Now, this isn't just a dry corporate history. It is a wild ride of incredible logistical ingenuity, fierce global rivalries, world wars, and honestly, some deeply complex modern paradoxes. So let's get right to it. Seriously, how does a small, unassuming shop in London that sold painted seashells transform into the fifth largest oil company on Earth? It sounds completely made up, doesn't it? But that is exactly what happened. The sheer contrast between the company's incredibly humble origins and its multi-billion-dollar reality today is just one of the most fascinating trajectories in business history. To understand how they got here, we've got to go back to where the whole thing started. Section 1, the Seashell Merchant. The story actually begins with Marcus Samuel's father. He owned this thriving little London import-export shop that was specifically famous for selling small, decorative boxes covered in painted seashells from the Far East. When the younger Marcus Samuel and his brother took over this humble trade in the late 1800s, they hit the ground running, expanding into new commodities like rice. But they sensed a much, much bigger opportunity on the horizon. Fast forward just a bit through their rapid expansion, and in 1897, the brothers officially incorporated their booming new enterprise. They named it the Shell Transport and Trading Company, specifically to honor their antique dealer father, who was actually known all around London as the Shell Merchant. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how they solved a massive global problem. Section 2, revolutionizing global transport. Picture this. Japan is industrializing at a breakneck pace, and they desperately need oil. The Samuel brothers decided to supply them, partnering with the Rothschild family who owned massive oil reserves in the Caucasus. But here was the catch. How do you move it efficiently? Before Samuel got involved, oil was transported in these leaky, super inefficient wooden barrels that just took up way too much cargo space. Samuel's bold, absolutely brilliant solution was to build a fleet of custom-designed steamships that could carry the oil straight through the Suez Canal. The very first of these, named the Murex, was a total game-changer. Oil could be pumped directly into these new steam-pumped tankers, which dramatically lowered the risk of leaks and made distribution exponentially cheaper. In 1892, the Murex became the first oil tanker to ever pass through the Suez Canal. It was a complete watershed moment in global trade. But getting the oil there was only half the battle, right? With their transport logistics locked in, the brothers now needed to capture the market from their biggest competitor, the American juggernaut, Standard Oil. Now, Standard Oil distributed all its kerosene in very distinctive blue cans. The Samuel brothers wanted to make absolutely sure their brand stood out on the crowded docks and in the shops. So what did they do? They made a brilliantly simple marketing move. They just painted all of their cans bright red. Sometimes you really don't need a complex strategy, you just need a bolder color, and it worked flawlessly. By the close of the 19th century, those bright red kerosene cans were the biggest part of their entire business. Section 3, the Oil Wars. The early 20th century, however, was absolutely brutal. Shell found itself in a massive, bitter, decade-long trade war with a Dutch rival in Sumatra. Combine that with plummeting oil prices after a huge overproduction crisis in Texas, and Shell was suddenly fighting for its life, with literally half of its tankers sitting entirely unused. Recognizing that neither company would survive this infighting while Standard Oil was rapidly monopolizing the global market, the rivals made a historic decision. In 1907, they merged. Royal Dutch took 60% of the new entity, handling manufacturing and production, while Shell took 40%, managing logistics and transportation. This move unified two of the biggest players in the East Asia market, and from then on, the colossal new business simply became known to the world as Shell. Section 4, fueling global conflict. This era kicked off a massive global technological revolution. To make sure their products stayed front and center in the public eye, Shell aggressively sponsored early aviation and automobiles. We're talking about supplying the fuel for the famous 1907 Peking to Paris motor rally and even powering the very first flight across the English Channel. But, and this brilliantly illustrates how external factors shape history, their greatest market advantage actually came down to one single number: 43. That is the exact number of different companies that U.S. lawmakers broke the massive Standard Oil monopoly into due to antitrust violations. This effectively dismantled Shell's biggest rival overnight, leaving a huge vacuum in the market that perfectly timed up with a skyrocketing global demand for fuel. The result of that massive advantage was just explosive. Between 1897 and 1927, the value of the company skyrocketed from $1.8 million to $26 million. To put that into perspective, in today's money, that would be equivalent to a jump of hundreds of millions of dollars. The seashell merchant's scrappy little logistics company had truly become an absolute titan of global industry. But, with that kind of massive global scale comes incredible geopolitical entanglement. During the World Wars, Shell became a highly critical partner for the Allied forces. Their London office was dedicated entirely to the war effort. They were busy innovating specialized aviation fuels that were absolutely vital for Allied pilots to keep flying. At one point, their fuel logistics were so crucial that the British government actually took direct control of Shell's tankers, classifying them as essential for the war effort. And despite taking heavy hits, like losing 17% of their entire worldwide production when Germany invaded Romania, Shell's relentless growth just kept going. By 1930, they were churning out 1/10 of the entire world's crude oil.
Section 5. The Climate Secret.
As a true oil colossus, Shell has continuously found itself at the absolute center of global concerns regarding environmental degradation, pollution, and climate change. And what's fascinating is that their internal understanding of this dates back decades. Let's look at 1988, when Shell sponsored internal research into the long-term impact of fossil fuels. The conclusions of that report were stark. The researchers warned that CO2 levels would double as early as 2030, that global sea levels would rise approximately 1 meter, and that the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet could even lead to a 6-meter rise. They warned of large-scale ecosystem destruction and explicitly noted that the effects were potentially, quote, the greatest in human history. Yet their public messaging was vastly different from their private research. Despite possessing this highly comprehensive internal evidence, Shell publicly denied any correlation between carbon emissions and climate change. Furthermore, they actively sought to discredit assertions made by others about the damaging nature of their business. The terrifying details of that 1988 confidential report were kept completely hidden from the public and actually were not released until a major leak in 2018.
Section 6. Profits versus Pledges.
Today, Shell's corporate identity is caught in a really fascinating paradox. In the 21st century, Shell heavily markets itself as a supporter of climate science. They advocate for the Paris Climate Agreement and publicly pledge to shift toward green energy and reduce fossil fuel dependency. So the crucial point is looking at the numbers behind those promises. There is a massive gap between those public pledges and their actual financial behavior. Over the previous decade, only 1% of Shell's long-term investments went toward renewable energy sources like wind and solar. The other 99% remained firmly rooted in fossil fuels and their traditional operations. And this is actively fueled by tens of millions of dollars spent every single year lobbying against the very climate policies they publicly say they support. This discrepancy definitely hasn't gone unnoticed. Looking ahead, Shell actually plans to grow its fossil gas business by 20%. This recently prompted the advocacy group Greenpeace to install a massive sign right outside Shell's London office reading, "Our profit, your loss." Critics widely accuse the company of corporate greenwashing, basically deceptively presenting themselves as environmentally friendly to mask their continuing massive fossil fuel footprint. This criticism is especially loud when Shell's own executives assure their investors that reducing oil output right now would be, in their words, irresponsible. And honestly, that strategy remains immensely lucrative for them. Despite the protests, the leaked reports, and the growing global push for renewable energy, Shell's financial power is just staggering. For the year 2022 alone, Shell posted earnings of almost $40 billion. Let's just take a second to recap the monumental modern scale of this enterprise. $40 billion in earnings, making up almost 12% of the global market share, producing 692 million barrels of oil in a single year. That equates to over 1.8 million barrels every single day. They stand today as the 5th largest oil company on the entire planet. When you look at these staggering numbers, it is genuinely hard to fathom that this all traces back to Marcus Samuel and his little London shop selling painted seashells. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly important question. Shell's logo, which started off as a simple, heartfelt tribute to a father's antique business, is now one of the most recognizable corporate symbols on Earth, completely synonymous with oil. But as the global energy system inevitably transitions towards a new future, we have to ask, can a company built on over 130 years of oil truly change its shell? It's a question with massive global stakes, and it's one that will absolutely define the next century of our world's history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.